Hello, today we are going to be making bread, and not just any bread, but the easiest recipe ever. I don't know if you can see that. I'll put the recipe down below, but there's only 4 ingredients, and if we do it right, it will turn out good. That's the thing, when you see a recipe for something, it's because all of the ingredients are important. If you leave out one of them, it might turn into something different, or it might not be bread. So we won't just be making bread, we'll do a bit of an experiment. So, 3 cups of flour. This first batch will just be normal, how it's supposed to be. That's 3 cups. And then there will be 1.5 teaspoons of salt. The salt is less important, but it adds flavor. And if you add bread, it just doesn't taste like anything. That's because there's no salt in it. There we go. Now we'll put in the yeast. Looks like this. You can get it in little packets or mini packets. And this you only need 1/2 teaspoon. It's the thing that's in there that is the least of anything. Looks like those. Dump that in. Then we will stir it. Doesn't really look like bread yet, does it? Our last ingredient is water. We'll do warm water, not boiling water, because if you do boiling water, it will kill the yeast. You want to do warm, so when you touch it, it just feels nice and warm. So, we've got 1.5 cups of warm water, and we will dump it in. Now this is different than how most people make bread. Most recipes mean that you have to knead it and mix it for a long time. And yeah, it's a bit more complicated. The one we're doing today is it's quick to mix, but then you have to let it sit for a long time. That doesn't look very breadish either. I'll mix it a bit with my hands just to make sure all the flour gets wet. Looks a bit more like normal bread dough, but we will now take that off, cover it up, and we have to let it sit for 12 hours. I'm gonna leave that right over there. But I said we might be making 2 batches of bread. This time, we are going to do a bit of an experiment. So you see the recipe, and you see all the ingredients. What would happen if we left one of the ingredients out? The yeast, there wasn't a lot of yeast in there. There was almost none. So we'll try it without any yeast in there and see if it turns out. And it looks pretty much the same now. I think maybe it'll turn out without that yeast. We will see. There we go. We've got 2 bowls with bread dough in it. The smaller one didn't have the yeast, and the other one had the yeast. And we will check in a little bit. Okay, this is about 3.5-ish hours later, and we'll take a little look. That's the one with the yeast. Looks like it's squishy. Could have probably mixed it a little bit more in the beginning, but I think it'll still all blend in together yet. And then we'll take a look at the one without the yeast. And that one feels about the same right about now. It's also squishy. one may be a little bit bigger. Yes, we'll come back in a few more hours. I also mixed it a little bit more so that there'd be a few less dry bits underneath. Okay, it's time to make some bread. So we will turn on the oven to 450 degrees. And then we will look at the difference between the two breads. This one has gotten kind of puffy. I should have probably mixed it more, but I didn't. And the one without the yeast, let's see how that did. That one looks kind of sad. It's a lot less poofy than that one. It's the same amount of everything else. But we'll see what happens when we bake them. You can see this one, there's air bubbles. There's an air bubble that will poof up when we poke it. It's pretty sticky dough though. In the beginning it felt really dry. Now it's kind of sticking to my hands. This one is kind of sticky too, but it's a lot harder to poke. Now we'll make a floured surface so that dough doesn't stick to the table. I've got flour on my hands so it doesn't stick to my hands so much. Okay, let's take the dough out, and we'll make it into a ball. Hear all those bubbles popping? And you can put it on the table and just tuck in the edges. Okay, and we'll cover it with the pot and leave it for half an hour. Okay, so this is a bit of an interesting bread recipe where you don't bake it in a bread pan. You can use a Dutch oven if you have one for camping or something to cook on top of a fire. I don't have one of those, so I'm going to use 2 pans that it'll bake with them on top of each other like that. So you need to be really careful if you do this that you don't burn yourself, because these are going to get really hot. So what we do first is, while the oven is heating up, these pans will go in there and heat up while the bread rises. And they will get so hot, so be careful. You're always using an oven mitt when you touch them, because you can even burn yourself through an oven mitt. Okay, so now the pans have been heating and they are very hot. And now take the other pan, put it upside down over top of the bread. So we put it in its own little cocoon. And this makes sure that the humidity stays up in there. And so this is really heavy too. I'll see if I can do it with one arm. Yes, that's very heavy. Okay. If you do it with 2 hands. We'll put it in the oven for 30 minutes, and then we'll take off the top pan and do it a little longer. Okay, so now the 30 minutes of baking with the lid on is done. We'll take off the top pan. Again, very, very hot. Whoop! I almost broke something, but I didn't. There we see the bread going. Oh, the pans are a bit too close. It didn't rise as much as it should have. But we'll let it go for a few more minutes. And now it is done. It looks like it almost got a little bit dark, but it will still taste good. I put a thermometer in too to make sure it would be the right temperature so it wasn't doughy inside. And it needed to get to 190 degrees. So now it smells good in the house. It smells like bread, surprisingly enough. What we need to do is let this sit until it cools off completely before we cut it though. Otherwise it'll get really sticky inside and be kind of gross. So I'll let it cool overnight and we'll come back tomorrow. Okay, so it's the next day and we are going to try the other dough. The pans are already warming up in the oven. And this already feels a lot different than the last one. It's nice and soft. The last one there was air bubbles popping and it was a little bit bigger. So we'll form this. Now let's try cutting open yeast-free dough. That does not look very much like bread. It feels all sticky and doughy. Now let's compare. This was the one with all the ingredients and the one without the yeast. That's a little bit sad.
Good morning. I am here again this morning to eat my breakfast, which looks kind of crazy, but I've got some of the good bread and eggs and avocado and some meat and some broccoli. It'll be delicious. Yeah, so this bread is pretty good. It was a little bit more tough, but after being toasted, it'll be good and the perfect texture. This other bread is not bread. After it cooled off, I tried cutting it again and I couldn't even cut it. It's like, you want to hear how it sounds when I drop it? That's not how a loaf of bread is supposed to sound. It is like, I don't know. You can like poke it like that and it's weird. It's not bread. And we only left out one thing, one ingredient, and it turned into something that was nothing like what it was meant to be. I don't know what you would call it now, a brick. Maybe I could make a whole bunch and build a house out of them. Yeah. So we only left out one little ingredient, a half teaspoon of yeast, and it is no longer bread. And that's kind of how it is with our lives too. Last week, Travis talked about sin and BB guns and like when you're shooting at the target, if you miss, then you didn't hit the target. And sin is when we aren't hitting the target or aren't doing what is right. And there's something else in the Bible called the law, and that was what God gave the Israelite people and to show them how to follow him. So there is lots and lots of rules. And it was to aim to be perfect and aim to be like Jesus. Well, Jesus wasn't there yet, but to aim to be like God, because he is perfect. And we want to know him and we want to be in a good relationship with him. So, God gave the law, and if you broke one part of it, you were guilty of breaking all of it. There's a verse in James where it says that. How about I read it? So in James 2 verse 10, for the person who keeps all of the laws except one is as guilty as the person who has broken all of God's laws. So if you do everything right but do one thing wrong in your life, you're guilty of breaking everything. And that's how it is with sin. If you do one thing that is wrong, then you're sinful. It isn't like, oh, if you do maybe 5 medium sins or break 5 little laws, then you're kind of half guilty. You're either guilty or you're not guilty. And when Jesus was on earth, he also said, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. God is perfect, and if we want to be with him, we have to be perfect. But we are just a whole bunch of, I don't know, whatever bread this is. I have sinned. In my last video, I talked about how I stole and lied. And there's other ways where I sin now too, and I'm prideful and I do what is wrong. And I am guilty, and I'm not good enough. And that is not very hopeful. If you think about it like that, that is a pretty sad place to be. But here's the thing. We aren't good enough, but God is, and Jesus is. And when Jesus came to earth, we'll hear more about him in the coming weeks, but he did not do any of those sins. He didn't do the one slightest little sin. Even one granule of wheat of yeast little sin. He didn't do any of that. And he died. One thing I didn't mention with the law, if they broke one of those sins, then they had to kill an animal. The animal would have to die on their behalf. And the animal would take the guilt, as they would trust that God would use that instead of them. So, yeah, we're not good enough. We can't do it, but God can. And Jesus died on our behalf. And because of him, we can be right with God. And we can know him. And he can give us strength to keep on doing what is right. So, I need to have a bite before this gets too cold. So yeah, think about that this week. When sometimes when we do things that are wrong, we take a lot of the blame on ourselves and we can't forgive ourselves. And then remember that Jesus died for it. And God can make you right with him again. And sometimes I look at myself like, oh, I'm doing pretty good right about now. And then realize even those little things that you do wrong, those are enough to separate you. And we are all in the same place and we all need God. And if you make the bread, let me know how it goes. But maybe put some yeast in it. That might help a little bit. See you.